There is an island in the Pacific that history turned into a warning. A warning about arrogance, a warning about collapse, a warning about what happens when human beings destroy the world that keeps them alive. For generations, Easter Island was used as a parable. A tiny triangle of volcanic land, stranded more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continent, covered with enormous stone faces staring across a ruined landscape. The story seemed obvious. A people arrived, built giants, cut down their forests, exhausted their soil, turned on one another, and collapsed before the outside world ever found them. The statues became evidence. The empty land became evidence. The silence became evidence. And the people of Rapa Nui became characters in a story written mostly by outsiders. But there was always a problem with that story. It explained too much, too neatly. It made the island into a lesson before the evidence had finished speaking. It turned the Moai into monuments of failure when they may have been monuments of memory. It turned survival into collapse. It turned one of the most extraordinary feats of human navigation in history into a tale of self-destruction. Then ancient DNA entered the argument. And what it found did not simply revise the story of Easter Island. It broke the moral of the story. The people of Easter Island were never who we thought they were. Not because they were less mysterious Alabam myths around them, but because the real mystery was older, wider, and far more human than the collapse story allowed. To understand why this matters, you have to begin with the map. Rapa Nui is one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. It sits in the southeastern Pacific, a small volcanic island surrounded by ocean in every direction. To the west are the wider islands of Polynesia. To the east lies South America. Between them stretches an expanse of water so large that, for a long time, scholars struggled to imagine regular contact across it before European ships. And yet the island itself exists because people crossed that ocean. The ancestors of the Rapa Nui were Polynesian navigators, heirs to one of the most astonishing maritime traditions in human history. They did not drift helplessly into the Pacific. They sailed it. They read winds, swells, stars, birds, clouds, and currents, with an intelligence modern maps often fail to honor. They found islands so small that a mistake of a few degrees could mean death. At some point, probably around the late 1st or early 2nd millennium CE, Polynesian voyagers reached Rapa Nui and made it home. And then, on that remote island, they began carving faces. The Moai are not just statues, they are presences. Heavy-browed, long-nosed, deep-eyed, cut from volcanic tuff, raised on ceremonial platforms called ahu, facing inland toward the living communities they protected. Their backs turned to the sea, their faces turned toward descendants. To outsiders, they looked impossible. How could a small island society carve so many enormous figures? How could they move them across rough volcanic ground? How could they support the labor? Where did the trees go? Why did statue building stop? Why were so many Moai later found toppled? A mystery formed around the island, and into that mystery rushed explanations. There were, broadly speaking, 3 old stories about Rapa Nui. The first was the isolation story. Under this view, Rapa Nui was the final edge of Polynesia, cut off from the rest of the world. Its people were Polynesian, but once they arrived, the ocean closed behind them. Their world became a sealed experiment in human society, a place where the consequences of environmental pressure could unfold without outside contact. The second was the South American contact story. This one had a long and controversial history. Some researchers argued that people from South America may have reached Polynesia, or that Polynesians may have sailed to South America and returned. The sweet potato, a crop native to the Americas but known across Polynesia before European contact, seemed to point toward a connection. So did certain linguistic and cultural clues. But the idea remained contested for decades because the ocean between Polynesia and South America looked, to many scholars, like too much water for the evidence to cross. The third story was the collapse story. This became the most famous. According to this version, the Rapa Nui population grew too large. They cut down the island's trees to move statues, exhausted their resources, destroyed their environment, descended into famine and warfare, and collapsed before Europeans arrived in 1722. In this telling, Easter Island became a miniature model of planetary disaster, a civilization that destroyed itself. Each story had something going for it. None of them fully survived the DNA. The first crack appeared before the genomes were ancient. In 2020, researchers analyzed genetic data from people across Polynesia and from indigenous populations along the Pacific coast of the Americas. They found evidence that Polynesians and Native Americans had contact before Europeans arrived in the Pacific. The signal was not vague. It pointed to a Native American source most closely related to indigenous people from present-day Colombia, and the estimated timing was around the early 13th century, roughly the same broad era when eastern Polynesia was being settled. This did not prove that South Americans founded Rapa Nui. It did not prove that the Moai came from the Americas. It did not resurrect the old fantasy that Polynesians were incapable of building their own civilization. It showed something more interesting. The ocean had not been a wall. It had been a road. That finding changed the map. For centuries, the Pacific had been imagined by outsiders as emptiness, an enormous blue absence separating people. But to Polynesian navigators, the ocean was not empty. It was textured. It had roots, signs, rhythms, and memory. The genetic signal suggested that somewhere in that vast water world, Polynesians and Native Americans met. Maybe Polynesian voyagers reached the coast of South America and returned west. Maybe Native Americans voyaged into the Pacific. Maybe the contact occurred not on Rapa Nui itself, but elsewhere in eastern Polynesia before later descendants carried the ancestry onward. The DNA could not give us the scene. It could only show that the encounter happened. Then came the 2024 study, and the story became even harder to simplify. Researchers generated ancient genome data from 15 individuals associated with Rapa Nui. These remains dated to the historical period, but they were crucial because they represented Rapa Nui genetic diversity before the great demographic catastrophes of the 19th century, the Peruvian slave raids, the epidemics, the near destruction of the population. The results addressed two arguments at once. First, the genome showed Native American ancestry, not European ancestry. Native American ancestry, about 10%, present across the ancient Rapa Nui individuals. And using genetic and radiocarbon-based modeling, the researchers dated that admixture to roughly 1250 to 1430 CE, centuries before Europeans reached the island in 1722. That means the Native American signal in Rapa Nui ancestry was not a colonial artifact. It was not the result of Europeans carrying people across oceans. It was older than that. It belonged to the Pacific world before Europe entered the story. The second finding cut even deeper into the island's most famous myth. The researchers found no genomic evidence for a severe population collapse in the 1600s. No clear bottleneck that would match the classic ecocide story. No genetic signature of a society that had swollen to unsustainable numbers and then crashed before Europeans arrived. Instead, the population history looked more like resilience. A small population, growing or remaining stable across centuries, adapting to a harsh and limited island environment. The catastrophe that truly devastated Rapa Nui came later, after sustained European contact, slave raids, introduced disease, and colonial violence. This is where the old story begins to fracture. For decades, Rapa Nui was treated as a warning about what people do to themselves. But the DNA suggests that the more devastating warning is about what outsiders did to them. The island did change. Trees disappeared. The environment was transformed. Life on Rapa Nui was never easy. No serious version of the new evidence says that humans had no ecological impact. But ecological change is not the same thing as cultural suicide. Deforestation is not automatically collapse. Resource limits are not proof that people failed. The Rapa Nui adapted. They built rock gardens, using stones to protect soil moisture, reduce erosion, regulate temperature, and grow crops such as sweet potatoes in a difficult environment. They organized labor. They carved and moved statues. They maintained communities on one of the most remote islands on Earth. The old collapse story saw scarcity and imagined stupidity. The new evidence sees scarcity and finds strategy. When two streams of evidence point away from the old story, that is not a minor correction. That is a signal. The genome said there was no severe pre-European population crash. The archaeology said people were adapting to limits rather than simply destroying themselves. The Native American ancestry said Rapa Nui was not sealed away from the wider world in the way outsiders imagined. Together they reveal a different island. Not a failed society, a resilient one. But the most dangerous mistake would be to replace one simple story with another. The DNA does not say the Rapa Nui came from South America. It does not say the Moai were built by outsiders. It does not say Native American ancestry defines Rapa Nui identity. It does not reduce culture to blood. What it says is more subtle. The people of Rapa Nui were Polynesian. Their language, culture, navigation, monument building, and island settlement belonged to the great Polynesian expansion across the Pacific. But somewhere in their deeper history, before Europeans arrived, their ancestors encountered Native Americans, where descendants of such an encounter carried that ancestry into the Rapa Nui population. The story is not Polynesia or America. It is Polynesia reaching far enough that America entered the genome. Imagine a canoe moving across the eastern Pacific in the 13th or 14th century, not a European ship, not a colonial expedition. A Polynesian vessel, guided by stars and swell patterns, moving through a water world its crew understood better than any outsider looking at a map. Somewhere beyond the horizon was another people, another coastline, another language, another food world. A meeting happened, we do not know where. We do not know whether it lasted days, years, or generations. We do not know what was exchanged besides genes. Sweet potatoes may have moved. Words may have moved. Stories may have moved. People certainly did. The DNA cannot give us their names. It cannot show us the first face seen across the surf. It cannot tell us whether the meeting was peaceful, practical, accidental, or remembered in oral traditions under forms we no longer know how to read. It can only tell us that the ocean was crossed, and that is not a small thing. Now imagine Rapa Nui itself in the centuries before European arrival. The island is not a ruin, it is alive. Smoke rises from houses. Fields are worked. Stone gardens hold moisture and dry soil. People move between the coast and inland gardens. Ceremonial platforms stand near the shore. Moai face the communities they were meant to watch over. The statues are not meaningless monuments to vanity. They are ancestors made visible, authority made stone, memory given a face. The faces are enormous because memory was enormous. And when later observers saw toppled statues, treeless hills, and a small population, they mistook aftermath for origin. They saw a wounded island and assumed the wound was self-inflicted. But history had intervened. Europeans arrived in 1722. After that came violence, disease, coercion, and the forced removal of people. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave raids tore away a large portion of the population. Smallpox followed. The Rapa Nui people were reduced to a remnant. That was a collapse, but it was not the collapse the old myth had advertised. It was not a morality play about foolish islanders who destroyed themselves for statues. It was a human tragedy shaped by contact, exploitation, disease, and power. This matters because stories about collapse are never neutral. When a society is described as having destroyed itself, responsibility shifts. The suffering becomes deserved. The survivors become descendants of failure. Their monuments become warnings rather than achievements. Their ingenuity becomes invisible. That is what happened to Rapa Nui. The Moai were treated as evidence of excess when they may be evidence of organization. The loss of trees was treated as proof of stupidity when the causes and consequences were more complex. The small 18th century population was treated as the residue of self-destruction, when genomic evidence now suggests there was no severe earlier bottleneck. The island was turned into a fable before it was allowed to be a history. Ancient DNA does not solve everything. It cannot tell us exactly how each Moai moved. It cannot explain every change in land use. It cannot reconstruct every voyage between Polynesia and the Americas. It cannot replace oral tradition, archaeology, ecology, or the authority of the Rapa Nui people over their own past. But it can remove certain stories from the table. It can tell us when a population did not collapse. It can tell us when an ancestry signal appeared before Europeans. It can tell us when a supposedly isolated island was, genetically, part of a larger oceanic history. And what it reveals is not a people who failed. It reveals a people who endured. The people of Easter Island were never who we thought, because what we thought was too small. They were not passive inhabitants of a doomed island. They were navigators at the farthest edge of human oceanic expansion. They were not evidence that isolation always leads to collapse. They were evidence that even the most remote communities could be connected by routes outsiders could barely imagine. They were not a society that simply destroyed itself before Europe arrived. They were a resilient island people whose worst catastrophe came not from their own monuments, but from the violent arrival of a wider world. And the Moai were never just stone faces staring over an empty island. They were ancestors. They were memory. They were proof that a small community, living under severe limits, could organize labor, move mountains of stone, grow food in difficult soil, and maintain a world at the edge of the sea. The old story made Rapa Nui a warning about collapse. The DNA makes it something else. A warning about easy stories. A warning about maps that mistake distance for impossibility. A warning about histories that blame the wounded before asking who wounded them. Somewhere in the genome of the ancient Rapa Nui is a thread that runs east across the Pacific, not to Europe, not to a colonial ship, but to the Americas before Columbus. Somewhere in their demographic history is not the signature of self-destruction, but of continuity under pressure. Somewhere behind the stone faces is not a vanished civilization, but a people still here, still connected to the island, still correcting the story told about them. The ocean was not empty. The island was not dead. The statues were not monuments to failure. And the people of Easter Island were not the authors of the simple tragedy the world assigned to them. The truth is larger. They crossed the ocean. They met the impossible. They survived the island. And for centuries, the greatest collapse in the story was not theirs. It was ours. The collapse of our imagination.